The following ramble, rant, whatever you want to call it, will likely surprise those of you in my audience who know that I'm very fond of role-playing games, because they tend to be very big on the mathematics, and they tend to be very big on the phenomenon that I'm about to rail against, effectively. But there is something of a plague within at least some circles of game development, which is fairly common in the likes of loot 'em ups, but is especially common in MMOs and JRPGs. And that is the curse of the extremely large number. What do I mean by this? Well, when you play, say, Dungeons & Dragons, the largest numbers you're going to be dealing with in common play are going to be in the hundreds. They're not going to be in the thousands. That's going to be more the realm of experience points, and you only calculate that at the end of a session. You just note down however many experience points you earned, and at the end of your session, then you just add up whatever you earned for that session, and then add it to your total. That's obviously going to get larger and larger as time goes on. You can end up with several thousands and tens of thousands of XP and all that. But again, that's just something you take note of, and then you add that up at the end of a session while you're actually playing, while you're rolling dice to do skill checks, or you're rolling dice to calculate damage rolls and things like that. The highest numbers you're really going to be dealing with are maybe in the hundreds at most, but far more likely they're going to be a lot less than that. Most people aren't necessarily going to have a problem with this because that's the level of math that pretty much everybody can do very quickly and easily. It's in the realm of what we'll call practical mathematics. It's the mathematics you deal with on a daily basis. It's the kind of math you don't really have to think about because you just immediately and intuitively understand how much of something 50 is, or how much of something 100 is. And yet, for a lot of people, that level of math is still too, what we would call, crunchy, where you're just spending a lot of your time crunching numbers rather than actually playing the game. Now, the problem here isn't necessarily that you can't do the math in your head. More often than not, you can. The problem is you can't keep all of the modifier values in your head the entire time. That's where the number crunching really comes from, just constantly stacking modifiers upon modifiers. You've got terrain modifiers, you've got flanking modifiers, you've got modifiers from equipment, you've got modifiers from abilities, you've got modifiers from skills, so on and so forth. And while none of these modifiers are particularly big on their own, they gradually add up, and the amount of modifiers is just difficult to keep track of. That's where you get the number crunching. Everything just gets bogged down in, okay, what modifiers apply to this scenario? What modifiers apply to that scenario? So on and so forth. Now, Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition tried to remedy this by introducing the advantage-disadvantage system, but then you start getting bogged down in, well, do you have the advantage or the disadvantage, or do they cancel each other out? Because then you're going to have modifiers playing into that instead, and then that can bog you down in an argument with the DM over whether you have advantage or not. But at least on paper, the idea has been reduced to, look, we have way too many modifiers to keep track of, so what we'll do instead is we'll condense this down into, if you have advantage, you roll 2 d20s and you pick the higher result, and if you have disadvantage, you roll 2 d20s and pick the lower result. There's basically no room for nuance in it. It's a dramatic oversimplification as far as I'm concerned of the entire modifier system, but at least you're not bogged down in, okay, what modifiers apply in this specific scenario every single time you go to make a roll. And then it's easier on the DM as well, because then they don't have to worry about all of the modifiers they need to apply to the difficulty rating and so on and so forth. It's all an attempt to take what was commonly seen as excessive mathematics in earlier editions and condense it into something that's a lot quicker and easier to pick up and play. This is because the vast majority of people do not think mathematics are fun. For the vast majority of people, mathematics are simply a means to an end. You might use it if you're, say, building furniture, or buying or selling things, or, of course, paying your bills, or something along those lines, but unless you're really weird, you're probably not going to be just looking up math problems to solve in your free time. And the more calculations you force the player to do, the more they're going to feel like they're taking an algebra exam rather than playing a game. Hell, all that number crunching is the exact reason I don't run D20 based systems anymore. The number crunching bogged everything down so much that I just wasn't having fun DMing it, and so I decided to move on to other systems that just weren't as crunchy. And what I've found in doing this is something that should be quite obvious to those of you who've been following this discussion up to this point. The less number crunching the DM and the players have to worry about, the more they can focus on the setting, the lore, the story that they're currently going through, the characters that they're playing, and their interactions with both NPCs and the rest of their party. You know, the actual reasons you're playing a role-playing game in the first place. And I've found that the best ways to do this are first off to keep the calculations very simple and straightforward so that they're easy to understand, and more importantly, keeping the numbers used in these calculations quite low. Again, going back to that idea of practical mathematics, the numbers that are small enough to where you intuitively understand what they are, and the calculations are so quick and easy for you to do that you can just do them in your head and not really think about it. Unfortunately, video game developers really haven't gotten that memo. Instead, they've done the exact opposite. If you go back and you play, say, a JRPG or an MMO or a looter game or something along those lines, you will find that it will very quickly start going from single-digit damage and double-digit health to double-digit damage, triple-digit health, and then from there it'll go into triple-digit damage and quadruple-digit health. And while that's usually where the cutoff is for, say, older JRPGs and such, more modern games simply seem to think number go up equal good. Well, there are a few problems with this. Remember that whole practical mathematics thing I mentioned earlier? Well, the practical cutoff for that, where most people are going to truly understand what those numbers mean, is quadruple digits. Once you start going beyond that, people have a really hard time being able to relate to those numbers. They can't really visualize what they mean anymore. I mean, sure, in academic terms, you'll understand that a million is twice as much as 500,000. But those numbers are still so large that your brain doesn't really comprehend them because it has no practical basis for it. The closest thing most people are going to have to a kind of practical basis for very large numbers is going to be money, and even that is abstract because most people aren't going to be carrying around thousands upon thousands of dollars. They might carry around a couple hundred at absolute most. Anything beyond that is the realm of writing checks, using pay cards of some description, or just digitally purchasing through a virtual wallet or something along those lines. So sure, you might look at price tags on things and say, oh, well, this house is $400,000, this car is $30,000, and so on and so forth, but as far as your brain is concerned, those are basically just abstract numbers. You're able to understand the concept of the number and that it is a large number, but it doesn't really mean anything to you individually. I'm sure you're wondering where I'm going with this. Well, the simple fact of the matter is that once you start going past those triple and quadruple digit numbers for damage and health, they become increasingly meaningless. Take, for example, the gameplay that you've been seeing throughout this video, which is of Tom Clancy's The Division 2. It's a looter shooter, and it is one of the prime examples of where this kind of thing goes completely off the rails. If you look at the damage numbers I'm doing and the stat numbers of my equipment and such, they are absurdly high. We're talking equipment stats in the realms of tens of thousands of points, and the actual damage I'm doing after you apply all passive bonuses and whatever, being hundreds of thousands of points of damage per hit. And the enemies are just tanking it like it's nothing. They clearly have millions of hit points. And that's not even at the highest world tier available. This is at world tier 4, the max is world tier 5. After I recorded the footage that I'm using throughout this video, I ended up going up to world tier 5, and what do you know? The enemy's stat values increase dramatically again. They take far less damage than the equipment that was perfectly acceptable for world tier 4, which means I need to grind for more equipment for world tier 5 that has even higher, even more absurd stat numbers, just so I can keep up with the amount of health the enemies have and the amount of damage they do. You don't find enemies using new tactics, you don't encounter any new enemy factions, you don't encounter new enemy types for the existing factions. By the time you get to World Tier 2, you've been introduced to every single faction in the game and every single enemy you will ever fight. It's just that bumping up that World Tier only affects the numbers. Enemy stat numbers go up, so the loot you find has to have stat numbers that go up to compensate for for this. And as those numbers keep getting higher and higher, not only does it become increasingly difficult to do the math in your head and actually determine whether things are significant upgrades or not, but you'll see numbers that go up dramatically, and yet the actual practical difference between that and the equipment you currently have is negligible. I mean, after all, what is the actual practical difference between a rifle that does, say, 50,000 damage per shot and one that does 60,000 damage per shot when enemies have millions upon millions of hit points? Sure, your loot goblin brain will see number go up, that mean good, but the actual practical benefit of it is maybe it takes a single shot less to bring the enemy down than if you were using the previous rifle. And that's when you already are wasting magazine after magazine of ammo on single enemies because they just have so much health. So sure, the numbers are getting higher. You think to yourself, oh, you go from a gun that does maybe 20 damage at the very beginning of the game on up to end game you're doing 50-60,000 damage per shot with whatever guns you're using at the end of the game. You think that's a massive power increase, but the reality is that you haven't actually increased in power. All the numbers have gone up across the board to give the impression that you've gone up in power, when the reality is you've stayed at a level plateau almost the entire game. Because as you've encountered enemies with higher stat values, you've found gear that compensates for the difference in those stat values, and thus you've just ended up with the same amount of practical damage dealt to the enemies and the same amount of practical damage dealt to you the entire time. So sure, the numbers have gone up dramatically. You're now doing hundreds of thousands of damage per hit. But you don't feel any more powerful, because those numbers are utterly meaningless. And while Division 2 is a looter shooter, and this is a problem with every looter shooter out there, it's also a problem with every looter game in general, stuff like Diablo and its ilk, and it's also a problem with JRPGs. The numbers just keep getting higher, but as they get higher, they become increasingly meaningless to the player. When the stat numbers stay relatively low the entire game, your brain can comprehend that math, and you can feel the difference a few points of damage can make. Meanwhile, you play a game like Disgaea, and suddenly you're doing septillions worth of damage, and it might as well be the same as when you play really early on in the game and you're doing maybe 20 damage per hit against an enemy with a couple of hundred hit points. And the question then becomes, if the practical difference between these absurdly high numbers and the numbers you experience at the lower levels of the game is more or less non-existent, then why do the numbers get so absurdly high that your brain no longer really comprehends the math involved? Well, there are a few reasons for it. One of them is simply tradition, particularly in the realm of JRPGs, where the numbers have tended on the large side for so long that it's just been seen as the standard, and deviating from that is seen as a bad thing, even when it would be a significant improvement. Another reason is the mistaken idea that having more granularity with the numbers is somehow a good thing. The reality is that once you get past a certain point with the numbers, the increased granularity becomes increasingly meaningless. I mean, sure, you can say that 50 versus 20 is a pretty considerable difference. You can also argue that, say, 100,000 versus 50,000 is a big difference. But is there really a difference between 50,000 and 50,300? Well, a mathematician will certainly say that there's plenty of difference between those two numbers, but in practical terms, that is such a negligible difference that it means basically nothing. So once you get past quadruple digits, the granularity argument really breaks down, and the higher the numbers get, the more it breaks down. But then, of course, there are two other major reasons you might see this. The first of them is one that I don't really think actually happens all that much, but I wanted to mention it anyway, just in case. And that is developer ego, where they're basically just trying to show off their math skills with all these large and seemingly impressive numbers and calculations. Now again, I don't really think that one actually happens very much, but it amuses the living hell out of me to imagine some developer thinking, yeah, I'm gonna show them how cool I am with all these really large numbers and complex calculations, when the reality is that nobody gives a shit. So if they're trying to show off, then it's a hilariously pathetic way of doing so. Again, though, while I'm sure that some instance of game development somewhere has had this, I really don't think it's a major reason for the number go up syndrome being as prevalent as it is. But now, let's face it, the real reason that so many games use such ridiculously large numbers is that it's an attempt to exploit the fact that your brain really doesn't comprehend those numbers very well at all. They don't really want you understanding what's going on under the hood and calculating things out. What they want you to do is just be impressed by the big number flashing on the screen that makes it seem like you're doing way more than you actually are. In other words, it's just a distraction, and most likely it's an attempt to distract you from how tedious and repetitive the game actually is. Now, obviously, if you're actually paying attention, then it's not really going to work. The tedium and repetition is still going to be abundantly clear. But that tells me that either a huge portion of the gaming population is just not paying attention at all, or they are paying attention and just don't really care. Either way, I really don't see this practice stopping anytime soon, and it bothers the hell out of me, because it means that rather than these developers building their games in such a way to where the numbers actually mean something and stat improvements feel impactful, they'd rather just slap something together that's tedious and repetitive and then try to distract the player with a bunch of big numbers flashing up on the screen to make it seem way cooler than it actually is. So, yeah, that's ultimately my message with this video. If you're an aspiring game developer, don't fall for the fallacy of number go up equal good. Because the higher those numbers go, the more and more meaningless they become to the player, and the more they just serve as a distraction. I'm not saying you should stick to numbers that are 2 digits or less, but understand that the lower the numbers are, the more impactful any kind of stat or equipment improvements are going to be. And generally speaking, players are going to appreciate and enjoy substantial equipment and stat improvements far more than if you just have a continuous trickle of numbers going up until eventually you end up in stupidly high number territory. And that about covers it. If you have further questions, then feel free to throw those in the comments, but as far as this topic goes, it's just been bouncing around in my head for a while because I keep running into games that have stupidly high numbers, and it always annoys me every single time because the numbers do get increasingly meaningless. So I decided, you know what, let's go ahead and make a video on it and just get the whole ramble out of my system, and then I can move on to other things. I'm also planning on making a similar rambly video about the whole live service and games as a service phenomenon that's currently plaguing the industry, so stay tuned for that. Should be up later this week as I'm recording this, so keep an eye out for that, probably on Saturday, maybe a bit later if I end up running into any problems that make me delay it. But otherwise, thank you all very much for watching and sticking with me throughout this long ramble here. I hope you all enjoyed the video and found it informative. And of course, if you like the kind of content I make on my channel, then please consider supporting it on Patreon. If you can't afford to or don't want to, that's fine, I understand, but the option is there if you're interested, and every bit really does help out. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.